Hello, magical people of the internet. I'm Jen, and welcome to I Never Thought I Would, where we discuss doing things we never thought we would do and the magical places that they can lead us to. I have an incredible guest today. His name is Edward Willett. He is an award winning author of sci fi and fantasy, and he also has an award winning podcast called Worldshapers. Hi, Edward.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. So, as you know, the cost of entry to have a little chat with me is to trade a story of doing something you never thought you would do and where it took you. So, I'm sure in your travels and through all your incredibly imaginative stories, you've had some interesting experiences in your life. So, why don't you share one with us?
Well, I think the one that has really struck me, and partly because I'm kind of in the middle of it still, is I do have the podcast, and I also have a little publishing company called Shadow Paw Press, and I was at the presentation of Sask Books, which is the Saskatchewan Association of Book Publishers, and there was this a woman came in and she gave a presentation on kickstarting an anthology, and she was quite successful at it, and I thought, hey, I know some authors. And so it took me a while to work up to it because Kickstarters are intimidating. But I did it and I successfully kickstarted an anthology. And what was really, I never thought I would do is that the people in this anthology are, best-selling authors, Hugo Award winners, Joe Haldeman, whom I read as a teenager. I have a story, a Hugo Award-winning story by Joe Haldeman in this anthology that I edited. And that's actually what I put in the introduction because the Kickstarter succeeded, obviously. And that's why I have the anthology Shapers of Worlds. And it was the fact that I was editing stories and the original stories that came in. I was editing stories that had never been seen by anybody except me, by some absolutely amazing authors. And it was so successful that I just last week, in fact, successfully concluded a Kickstarter for Volume 2. The first one featured authors from the first year, and the second one features authors from the second year. And this probably means about a year from now, I'll be doing one for authors from the third year.
Wow, that's incredible. So what's it like when you have the opportunity to work with somebody who you looked up to in your childhood that you never imagined you would meet, let alone collaborate with?
It was really cool. I actually met Joe, and he's the one that's first and foremost in my mind because his book, The Forever War, one of the seminal works in science fiction, came out. I would have been a mid-teens probably when it came out, and I read it back then and never thought. I mean, back then to me, all of the authors in science fiction and fantasy were like, I don't know, gods might be a little strong, but they were at least these high off figures that I would never get close to. And then as I started getting published and going to conventions, all of a sudden I was meeting them. And every time I met one, it's like I'd be sitting there thinking, I'm having dinner with, Ben Bova or Joe. And then I met Joe and his wife Gay at a convention in Calgary. And it was like hung out with them quite a bit, spent quite a bit of time with them. And I thought, this is just, I never thought this would ever happen. And then even then, after I'd met these people, and everybody, of course, that was in the book, I had at least met and talked to on the podcast. I never thought I'd be editing an anthology with their stories in it. So it was very gratifying, and I've always felt a little removed from everything because of being off here in the, I wouldn't say the wilds, but in Saskatchewan, far, far away from New York and all these places. And the fact that I've now actually had the opportunity to meet these people and work with them it really is very gratifying and amazing.
Wow, that is incredible. I've had a couple of opportunities in my travels as well to collaborate with people that I looked up to as a teen and a young person. And it's just such a surreal experience. So I want to get into this Worldshapers podcast. So, what does, because all of this stemmed from doing a podcast and interviewing these people. So, what was the catalyst for beginning the podcast? And how did you go about attracting such big names to come and chat with you?
Well, the catalyst was I had done this sort of thing, not podcasts, but my degree was in journalism, and I started my career as a newspaper reporter and a photographer and editor at the Weyburn Review, Weyburn, Saskatchewan, population 6,000. 10,000, sorry. It was more like 6 when we first moved there. And so that was kind of what I did, was interview people. And then when I moved on, for a while, I was communications officer at the Saskatchewan Science Center, and I started doing a weekly radio science column. So for 17 years, I had this weekly science column on the CBC radio here in Saskatchewan as part of the afternoon edition. I was interviewed. It wasn't technically a column. I was asked questions and we had a conversation like this, but I was on radio a lot. And I hosted my own radio program then on community radio for a while. And for many years, I hosted a television program, a phone-in television program on local television where people phoned in with their computer problems. I was kind of just the MC because I didn't know that much about the computer problems. So they'd say that, I'd say, that's a very interesting question, Bob. And that would be, but I had a lot of experience being on air and doing that. So podcasting came along. And I kept thinking about it. I could do that, but again, it's always that learning curve and that impetus to get going. And it was actually the launch of my new series from Daw Books, my main New York publisher, which is called Worldshapers, that I thought this is an opportunity to start the podcast I've talked about, talk to science fiction and fantasy writers about how they create things, because the whole Worldshapers book series is this labyrinth of shaped worlds, where it's sort of like authors living inside the worlds they've shaped, very much kind of the concept behind it. So that all tied together. So it was that sort of, I can do a little marketing, I can start this thing I've always talked about starting, and I can talk to people that I really want to talk to. So I did all my homework and I figured out how to do it. And then I went to people I'd already met, because I have been in the field long enough now that I was going to conventions and I would meet people. So I started with people I knew really well, like Robert J. Sawyer, whom I've known for years, and Tanya Huff, who's a fellow author at Daw Books with me, and John Scalzi, big name in science fiction. And I met him at a WorldCon, World Science Fiction Convention in Toronto. I was the first person he met in science fiction outside of his editor, because he arrived at that convention late. He was running into his first panel, and I was on the panel, and I said hi, and that's how we met. And so I could call him up and ask him to be on. So those are my first 3 guests. And so I talked to people, that I had met at conventions, was one place I started. And then once I had spoken to a few people like that, it's very easy now to say, I've talked to John Scalzi and Robert J. Sawyer and Joe Haldeman and David Brin and V.E. Schwab and, all these people. And would you like to be on my podcast? And almost invariably, they say yes. So it's now become a fairly, if I want to find somebody to talk to, it's not hard to get people to say yes. Authors like this kind of, and it is an hour-long podcast where you get to go in depth about your creative process. And most authors like me kind of love to talk shop. So it's me as an author talking to another author and about the creative process. And it's just worked out really well.
That sounds wonderful. And you won an award for the podcast. You won the Aurora Award.
Yes, that was very nice. It's funny. I've won an Aurora Award twice. I have a novel called Mars Seguro, which came out in 2000 and I guess it would have been out in 2008 or 9. It won in 2009 anyway, and it won an Aurora Award. And when it won, my publishers from New York, Betsy Woldheim and Sheila Gilbert from Daw Books, were there because the Auroras were given out that year in Montreal with the World Science Fiction Convention. And so I won. And then I've been nominated, but I hadn't won again. And then in 2019, the Auroras were in Ottawa for CanCon, which is the Canadian Science Fiction Convention. And it happened that Sheila had come up from New York to be at that convention. I think she was editor guest of honor. And so I won again. So clearly I only win when my editor is in the room.
Well, you need to keep her with you more often.
Because the next year I was shortlisted, but I didn't win the next year. So, and she wasn't there. So there you go.
Well, Sheila, come on.
Exactly. Yeah, that was really nice because the Aurora Awards are a fan nominated and voted on award. So members of the Canadian Science Fiction Fantasy Association, it costs all of $10 to join, can nominate for the Aurora Awards and then vote for them. And so it's an indication that there are people out there listening to me, which is always nice to know.
Definitely. Yes. It's nice to know that your peers recognize you for your work.
Yeah, it's very gratifying. The first time I won was particularly gratifying. It was like my first book I'd written for DAW that I had written specifically for them. My first book with them was one they picked up in paperback from somebody else.
Mhm.
My editors were there, my publisher was there, so it was really nice. And it is that feeling of, it's if you're old enough, you remember Sally Field winning an Oscar and saying, they like me, they really like me. And it is a bit of that
Clip.
feeling.
I don't think I saw the live event, but I've definitely seen that clip. It's in the zeitgeist.
Yeah, it's become a meme.
Exactly. Well, that's fascinating. So now I want to get into Shapers of Worlds and get into a little bit of the content. So it's an anthology of other science fiction, fantasy writers living in the worlds that they've created.
Well, Worldshapers is people living in the worlds they've created. Shapers of Worlds, some of them were set in worlds that the authors had written in before, and some of them were just new stories. The idea is really kind of I think of it as a cabinet of curiosities. A lot of anthologies have a specific theme.
Mm-hmm.
And, my theme was simply that these people had been my guests. So we had everything from YA to fantasy, hard science fiction. There were all kinds of stories in the book. Then the world, I know, because I named everything so similarly, it's hard for me to remember sometimes.
Well, okay, so let's just clarify. So Shaper of Worlds is the anthology.
That's the anthology.
The Worldshapers podcast preceded the Shapers of Worlds anthology.
Because the anthology came out of the podcast. But then I have the book series with DAW Books, which is called Worldshapers.
So you have the series Worldshapers. From there came the Worldshapers podcast. And from the podcast came the natural kind of progression of an anthology of all of your guests who are Worldshapers.
There you go.
Okay, great. No, well, just wanted to get it all together in a clear timeline. So when did you start writing Worldshapers before the podcast?
Well, the book itself, I mean, the publication coincided with the start of the podcast. So the book had been written.
Clever. Very clever.
Yeah, almost a year before. I would have been writing I probably turned it in around January, something like that. So I'd been writing it the year before, which would have been 2017. And then, of course, there's all the editing and revision and proofreading and all that stuff. So the story itself, I wasn't even thinking about the podcast when I wrote the book. That all kind of came to my head later. But yeah, that book was in the works in 2017, early 2018, and then was published in September of 2018 or August of 2018. Yeah, right at the same time that the podcast started.
Okay, so that launch coincided with the podcast. And then how long had you been doing the podcast when you decided to start the Shaper of Worlds anthology?
It had been going on, let's see, the annual meeting of Sask Books was in April and I had started in August. So whatever that is, 7 months, maybe 7 or 8 months.
So less than a year.
Yeah. And I had the idea and then I started, well, I almost immediately sent out an email to my authors who had been guests to see who would be interested, because I had to have, if I didn't have anybody interested, then this wasn't going to happen. And I was gratified. I had 18 authors eventually that said they would be part of this, and that's more than enough for an anthology.
That's a lot. That's amazing.
Yeah. And I only do the podcast every 2 weeks. So I don't know how many I had in the first year, but it should have been roughly 26 in the first season. There may have been a bit more. So it was a pretty high take up. And actually the new anthology is even more. I have 24 authors, as I've said yes to it. And that's there's probably only, I don't know, maybe 8 authors that said for whatever reason they couldn't be part of it. Usually it's just that they have too many commitments and they just can't, or even if they're interested, but they can't write a new one because they're too busy, but they don't have any reprints that are free to be resold. I had some of that sometimes as well. But yeah, it's really, really gratifying, the number of them that said yes.
Can you give us like a sneak peek about maybe one of the stories in Shaper of Worlds? Is that allowed?
Yes, well, I mean, it's all out there. I think one that I enjoy is by Shelley Adina, who wrote I mean, they're all great stories. The reason I enjoy this one is because one of my Kickstarter um, backers rewards are what are called Tuckerizations. Tuckerizations in science fiction is where you get your name used as a character in the book. That goes back to an author named Wilson Tucker who used to do that with people that he knew. And several Tuckerizations were offered, and one of them was by Shelley Adina for the story that she was going to write for Shapers of Worlds, which is in her kind of steampunk world that she has. And my wife took that Tuckerization. So my wife is a character in the story. It's this steampunk race in London of aerial machines and steam-powered aerial machines. And it's a lot of fun. And my wife is an engineer, and the character that appears in The Knack of Flying is basically a young female engineer. So so it was a really good match. And that's just one story. They're all great. Among the reprints, though, the one that I mentioned was Joe Haldeman's story Tricentennial, which came out in 1976 and still holds up remarkably well for that. And that was the one I have a Hugo Award-winning short story by Joe Haldeman in the story. And then David Brin, another huge name, provided a story as well. John Scalzi provided a reprint. And yeah, I couldn't be happier with all of them. And I wrote a story too, because I was actually a guest on my own podcast. But I'm the host, so I'm going to put one in the new anthology too, even though I wasn't a guest in the second year.
Yes, of course. Of course you do. What an amazing accomplishment to be able to put that together. Well, you have several books out. And I'd like to talk about another one, The Moonlit World.
That's a book 3 now in the Worldshapers series. So the first book was called Worldshaper, and it's the Worldshapers series. It came out at the same time as the podcast, The Worldshapers, which gave rise to Shapers of Worlds, just to keep that all confusing. But the premise of the whole Worldshapers series, as I said, is that there's this labyrinth of shaped worlds, and the shapers of these worlds, they're all from our world originally, but they have the ability to shape these worlds in this strange labyrinth of extra-dimensional labyrinth. There's actually a science fiction, but it reads like fantasy. It's a science fiction backstory, but it actually reads like fantasy. So they all came from our world, and they were basically given a world to do with as they wish. And in the first book, we meet our main character, Shauna Keyes, who's the shaper of her world, but she doesn't know. She's the only one who's forgotten the fact that she shaped her world. She just thinks it's the world. And it's a lot like ours, but not quite. There's some differences, like kite fighting is a big collegiate sport, and the president is a woman who lives in the Emerald Palace, not the White House. So, things like that. And then this mysterious stranger shows up. There's a horrible attack, and this stranger shows up and explains things to her and can't understand why she doesn't know what's going on. And she's lost her world. This adversary who's come in has stolen her world from her, taken the knowledge of the shaping of it, and is going to turn it against her. And the stranger tells her that Carl is his name, that she can save all of these shaped worlds from this horrible adversary if she'll come with him, travel from world to world, gather the knowledge of their shaping, and take that to Agraire, who's this mysterious woman, or she's not really a woman, but force at the center of the labyrinth. That's the big picture. So in the first one, it's in a world like ours, and it's basically an extended chase across the Northwest United States and out into the ocean. The second book was called Master of the World. It's set in a world shaped by somebody who really likes Jules Verne. So it's all, submarines and flying machines and all that good steampunky stuff. And then the new one, The Moonlit World, I like to sum up as werewolves and vampires and peasants. Oh my, because it's that kind of a world. So it's a world where the moon is always full and extra big too, just for special effects. And there are werewolves and there are vampires and there are ordinary humans. Everybody was living in harmony, but something went wrong and that harmony is shattered, and my characters end up plopped down in the middle of this world and have to find the shaper of the world and escape it without getting, drained of blood or turned into a werewolf, basically.
You have such an incredible imagination. Like, I love the sci-fi genre. I love fantasy. I'm really into vampires and werewolves. I totally love that. And I'm always so impressed with authors who have this ability to create a world outside of our own. And it's just so fascinating to me. Did you always have this crazy imagination as a child? Like, where do you think you got your influences from?
I think there is a genetic component to being a writer. I really do. Because, some people, it just seems to seize them and off they go. Um, I was a big reader. Most writers are, I think, when they start out. And I had two older brothers, and they read science fiction, and so that was around the house. And some of the earliest books I remember reading were science fiction, the things like Danny Dunn and his anti-gravity paint. I still remember that one, and things like that. So when I started writing, I was 11 years old. It was a rainy day, and my friend and I decided we'd write stories for something to do because, of course, we didn't have computer games back in those days. I wrote a short story, and it was called Castor Glass Hypership Test Pilot because that's how much I was already into science fiction. And I just kept writing from there. I wrote 3 novels in high school, and I went into university. I already knew I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be a scientist for a long time, and so I still had that interest, and that came from science fiction as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then my other interests were like music and acting and stuff like that, and I do that too. So, but I realized you could make a living as a writer, so that's why I went into journalism to start with. But I kept writing and writing and writing and writing, and I sold some short stories, and I finally sold a novel, but to a lousy publisher. And so I worked at it, and I had a dozen or more unpublished novels, and wasn't having much success. And when I did publish, it was with a terrible publisher I never should have signed the contract for.
Oh.
But then I got picked up by Daw Books, and now I'm up to my 12th, working on my 12th novel for one of the major science fiction fantasy publishers in the world. So it took me a long time to get there, but I did eventually start writing at that level. I can't imagine not writing is what it comes down to. And most of the writers I talk to, it's the same way. It's like if I didn't write, I'd go crazy, or it's not exactly a compulsion, but it's pretty darn close.
Yeah, I compare it to, have you seen the movie Quills with
No,
Jeffrey Rush, where he plays the Marquis de Sade?
no, I haven't seen that one.
Okay, there's a scene because he's arrested because of what he's writing, because of the content, and he's put in a cell, and he starts writing in his own blood on his bed sheets because it's such a compulsion. And
well, I'd be scraping on the walls, I'm sure, at least. So.
well, yeah, it goes a little further than that. I don't want to give it away for people who, even though it's an older movie, I don't want to do any spoilers, but it's historical, so everybody knows the Marquis de Sade. If they're familiar with him and his work, they know that he was arrested, and it was very controversial at the time. He went insane because they wouldn't allow him to write what he was writing. And not that far gone. Thank God. There was probably some element of mental illness there too, but I understood the compulsion and the obsession and the need to get it out, or you're going to explode.
Yeah, there's also a great deal of pleasure in procrastinating about and writing as well, putting it off. I don't know what that's, because I really want to write, and I do write, and I write quite easily when I sit down and write, but getting that initial push and actually starting the words flowing can sometimes there's always the cat to clean and the house to vacuum, or the cat to vacuum and the house to clean. I don't know.
Well, I just tell myself when I'm in that mode that the idea is not fully formatted yet and it's not ready. I'm very much in a state of allowing when I write, and the ideas tell me what they're going to be, and they tell me when they're ready, and I kind of hold on to ideas. I talk about letting the pot simmer until the top's going to blow off, and once the top's ready to blow off, then I know it's time to sit down. But sometimes if you sit down too soon and you're not ready, it's just an exercise in futility, number one, and it's just really discouraging. You don't feel good about it.
One of the great things about the podcast is that I've now talked to 81 authors, and this is precisely the sort of thing we talk about. Is we talk about their biography, all that stuff to begin with, but then it's about just going through the process. idea generation, planning, outlining, the actual writing process, which varies from, and both of those vary a lot from, well, I have an idea and I just start writing to, oh, I write 150 pages of outline before I start writing anything. Those are kind of the extremes I've had on the show.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the, revision process. Some people get it all out in one draft and then go back and do a lot of revisions. Some do a rolling revision, so it's pretty much done when they get to the end.
Mm-hmm.
And then the editorial process, and then we talk about the philosophy of writing, why you write, why do you do this? And that's where these answers come out of, well, because I'd go crazy if I didn't, or so yeah, it's one of the things that I really enjoy about doing the podcast is this kind of conversation of why do we do this crazy thing that we do?
Yes,
It's not for the money, I can guarantee you that.
and it's not for the money, but when you love something enough and you stick with it and you keep flexing that muscle over decades, some sort of success or recognition is kind of inevitable. It's when people expect it to come fast, or sometimes it does come fast, but then it's not sustainable because it is a muscle that you have to flex regularly, whether it's music, performance, writing, painting, anything that we do in life. Even if you're practicing law, if you don't practice law for 10 years and then you just jump back into it, you're not going to be at the top of your game. Now for the important stuff. Where do we find you, your podcast, your books? How do we get them?
My books are available everywhere. Whatever bookstore you want to look online, you'll find them. You may not find them all in a physical bookstore,
Mm-hmm.
but everything's available mostly as ebooks and as print books and some audiobooks. Not everything. I don't have as many books out in audio as I would like. I actually have recorded some of my own. And I would like to do, but there's this time issue, and recording audiobooks is really time consuming. So you can find me at edwardwillett.com, just my name.com, 2 T's on Willett. People always leave off that second T. You can find my little publishing company is at shadowpawpress.com, and a lot of my books, obviously, that I put out through there. They're mostly books that were orphaned by other publishers at this point, but there's some new ones there as well. And of course, the Shapers of Worlds anthology is there as well. And then the Worldshapers podcast is just at theworldshapers.com. And I'm also on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all that stuff.
Excellent. And we'll have all the links below to make it easy for everybody to find you. I want to thank you so much, Edward, for taking the time to chat with me today. This was so interesting and enlightening. I'm always fascinated by sci-fi writers because that's not my genre. It's not where my mind goes. And it's just such an amazing talent. And I'm so impressed.
Well, to me, it's just, I can't imagine writing, well, I've written a ton of nonfiction as well, but I can't imagine not writing science fiction fantasy. It's just where my head goes when I start writing fiction. There's going to be a fantastical element of some sort.
That's so much fun. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. And I want to thank all of you out there in the interweb for tuning in. Check out edwardwillett.com. You can find his podcast, all his phenomenal sci-fi books. And I'd like to challenge all of you out there to do something you never thought you would do. And let us know where it leads you in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and have a beautiful day.